Good afternoon, everyone. I want to welcome you to this last session before we have our Appendix K panel here in the LDAR rooms, but excited to hear a little bit of a discussion on consent decree preparation and implementation from Mike here. Mike Ogden oversees Trihydro's Mid-Continent LDAR Services Group, provides technical support, leadership on projects involved in air permitting, compliance, environmental investigations, and field services. He's got over 21 years of experience in the environmental industry, and project experience includes project management and reporting, third-party consent decree audits for LDAR, environmental monitoring compliance, and LDAR program development and implementation. So, Mike, appreciate it and look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you. I have to find out who wrote that for me. It's so much more important than I feel someday. Can everybody hear me okay? Okay. I'm not very good at just standing behind the microphone or behind the podium all the time, so hopefully I won't be going back and forth too much, but it's 3:15 on Thursday and last night was spasmodic, so any participation is welcome, but I also know that this is late in the day for this time of the week. So really the reason that I decided to offer this presentation was here a couple months back, had a client, really fairly senior in a midstream company, ask, hey, what are you seeing in consent decrees in midstream? What kind of things could we potentially be looking for if we have something pop up? What are you seeing in the different consent decrees that have popped up in the recent years? And so it kind of clicked in my head that while we have seen plenty of consent decrees in refinery, it's only been the recent years that we've seen consent decrees in the midstream sector. So a little about what I'm going to talk about. I'm not going to touch on each of these right this second, but really kind of where we at, how did we get here, what can I expect, and then how do I prepare for it? Once I've prepared and that time come, then now how do I implement? So when I mentioned a second ago that we're seeing some different things for the midstream side. I think that back in the 90s, early 90s is when we started to see consent decrees for the upstream or downstream side, the refinery sector. And now it's only really been in the last 5 to 8 years that we started to see an increase in that regulatory scrutiny on the midstream side. And that comes from various reasons. We've also seen quite a few regulations change. You almost feel as though there's a new regulation for midstream every couple of years. So to which point, more regulation means more opportunity for entry into the facilities and better understanding. Realistically, we're seeing a lot of other aspects to this too, right? NGOs, as you've seen this whole week, there's a lot of different ways to see or understand fugitive emissions from a facility, whether that's a drive-by, that's a flight, or from a satellite. So much less with EPA showing up with a camera and saying, hey, I see something. And if that's not bad enough, then again, a private entity has access to a FLIR camera, can take videos, not necessarily knowing what they see, but still presenting something that might look less than pleasurable to the eyes. So we know that there are numerous CDs that have been lodged over the last 8 years. As I mentioned, roughly 2015 is kind of where I look at is with the merit consent decree, and then several since that time. I think that the Mark West CD was probably a little more eye-opening for some, and where EPA looked at some additional things that hadn't necessarily been considered. Actually, Costa spoke this morning, mentioned pilots operated PRVs and how those may stick. That was a piece that was added into the Mark West consent decree to have forcing them to pipe all of those pilot bells to a control device. And so that came at a significant cost. How did we get here? Really, there's some of the common violations that we've seen are born out of those 114 data requests. Some of it is if they come on site, they do comparative monitoring. their comparative leak rate is different from your historic leak rate. Well, are you monitoring by method 21 properly? If they're going to go out and observe your technicians, whoever's completing that work. And again, if they're not completing that work correctly, that's one more opportunity for that violation. And that doesn't include really the other low hanging fruit when you get to a facility, which might be things like an open-ended line. Some of the things that also are common that we see in the field or have seen in the past is misuse of delay of repair. So it doesn't meet the definition. Can you really get out there and get that component monitored? Other aspects might be mismodification triggers. If you're a KKK facility or self-identifying as a facility that is grandfathered, at some point in time, there's a pretty fair likelihood if you've made changes or modifications to that facility, then have you gone through the process and evaluated whether or not you should have tripped into the next height, whether that's quad O, quad OA, et cetera, to be monitoring at those lower leak definitions. Some of the things that we also see have to do with if you're not finding leaks, you have a low leak rate. Well, so that is probably going to fall into your reporting too. So I believe DOSA said this morning that 1 in 4 reports or 1 or 4 facilities was reporting 0 leaks. Where are they going to start to look for a facility that may require some improvement? If you're in a KKK facility and you're at 10,000 parts per million, you very well may not be finding many leaks. Additionally, if you've implemented an in-house rule for yourself to repair those leaks before it gets to a leak point, I'm not going to report as many of those leaks either. So really, it just kind of depends upon how you've approached that facility. So some of the midstream consent decrees that we've seen, as I mentioned, going back to the merit, you're looking at maybe a civil penalty of up to $900,000, maybe $3.25 million in the case of BCP. And then that doesn't include the environmental mitigation project at $1.5 million. So those numbers can add up real quick. Some of those things we'll speak to in a minute as to if you want to get buy-off on your facilities, start talking about how these triggers can affect a facility and a plant and maybe even some of that bonus structure. So common requirements, I'm not going to jump right into these, but what I am going to cover is some of the regulatory changes that are going to come in a consent decree if it's been issued. Talk about the administrative requirements and the field work practice changes that goes along with that. So oftentimes, again, you're going to be looking at a change in your regulatory requirements. If you're a KKK or a quad O covered facility at this point in time, you're going to be moved into a quad OA requirement. You're going to have the lower leak definitions. You're going to have some enhancements on top of that. We'll speak more to that here shortly. Some of the pieces that we also identify as the elimination of a skip period monitoring, and then AWP being something that is allowable over time, but certainly not something that is right out of the box in that consent decree you're going to be able to from a, excuse me, from an administrative standpoint and written requirements, you're going to have an LDAR work plan. And if it's something that's in that work plan, then you have to make sure that everybody in your facility understands that. They know what's in it. They know if you have, it also is going to be something that identifies who does what. What are the roles and responsibilities of the people at your facility, whether that's operations, whether that is the LDAR technician, or whoever might be running that LDAR program, whoever your LDAR SME might be. Where we run into issues sometimes is maybe that LDAR SME is sitting in one city, but a lot of the facilities might be out in the field. How that is actually implemented at the field level, oftentimes is how we got to being in a consent decree in the first place, was that disconnect from the field to the main office. So making sure that you've got quality NOC procedures. Again, if you've got a lot of facilities that you're working with, making sure that MOC program is in place, incorporating your LDAR program into that MOC program is also very important. Training programs, with respect to the consent decree, it's going to require that you have a training program for anybody that's going to be touching that LDAR program. It's typically going to be initial and then annually thereafter for anybody that's actually touching the program, from the standpoint of going out, monitoring, handling the reporting expectations, and handling your consent decree or the QA/QC expectations. Then you may have a slightly different requirement, maybe every 2 years, for basic operators, individuals that aren't touching it all the time, MOC program. So again, it's going to be similar training requirements, but you may have a different schedule for that. From a QA/QC program, one of the things that you're going to, I guess, hear or see throughout the time of this discussion is it's more. It's more observation, it's more documentation, it's more training, it's more monitoring. And so with the QA/QC program, it's more quality control. So now you're going to be seeing a quarterly QA/QC walkthrough of your facility. You're going to see a quarterly report of that, observation of the technicians, review of the documentation from those technicians. You may also have a requirement for those technicians to sign off on all of the work that they did on a daily basis. Each of these points is a point for an opportunity to have a deviation in your consent decree requirements. So once you get through that quarter, now you have to report it. You're reporting any deviations you found. You're also identifying a corrective action plan. So how are you then also going to put those policies and those procedural changes so that you can eliminate that? So if you have a technician that's not monitoring by method 21, what did you put into place to fix that? If you identified an open-ended line or 5 open-ended lines, what are you going to do to alleviate that problem facility-wide? Get that into your CAP, report that, then will be reported to the state and the EPA. Audits. So something that we feel as though aren't observed or not seen a lot unless there's a consent decree in a midstream facility. We don't see a lot of third-party audits, voluntary third-party audits, I should say. So we see a little more of that from other operators, but we do have, I think, one client that's got us doing a routine third-party audit. But in this case, you're going to have third-party audits every 4 years or every 2 years. But the every 2 years is because every 4 years will be a third party required. You can do that third party or do an internal audit every 4 years, but it's an alternating time frame. Most folks that we work with, especially in the refining sector, they just go ahead and have that done third party across the board every 2 years rather than trying to complete that in-house. Permit updating. Okay, now that you have the consent decree or you have a consent decree that's coming, what is likely to be placed into that is whatever is in that consent decree is going to go into, be required to go into the permit. Which the real tie to this is if you are hoping to get out of that consent decree, you may meet all of the expectations and obligations of the consent decree, but because of the fact that most or all of it has been written into your permit, you're getting out of the consent decree per se, but you're still going to have to follow the expectations of that. So earlier I mentioned work practice changes. So again, you're going to go from a less stringent to a more stringent regulation. Even if you're in Quad O and you're going to go to Quad OA, it's going to require that most likely will require that 2 consecutive monitoring events, monthly monitoring events to get yourself back onto a quarterly schedule. And so that's, again, more time and effort. Additionally, you are going to be in a position that now you're working on getting your connectors involved in here if it was a KKK facility. That one will be a significant effort. The other thing that really kind of catches folks sometimes is the internal leak definition for that enhanced LDAR program. So now you have an initial repair attempt at we'll use 200 as an example, 200 ppm. So if you have a reading between 200 and 500, you're now in a position that you have to make a repair attempt at that. Consent decree will also likely tell you that not only do you have to make that repair attempt within 5 days, but you also have to have the follow-up monitoring event. And so if you make the repair on day 2, you now have the next 24 hours to get that repair attempt monitored by the board. So move that forward. If you make, what we see is we start to see more leaks pop up. If you have something at 200 ppm, you throw a wrench on it, twist on it, remonitor it. Now you may be above 500. Now you have a federal leak that you're now reporting, whereas that sub 500 leak was not something you were including on your semi-annual report. Other work practice changes.
Really quick.
Yep.
Do you have numbers on how often that happens? Where you go, you got a 200 leak and tighten it, and it goes to 500. What ballpark ideas?
I can't give you a ballpark number on that, to be honest with you. I could go in and probably pull that data from specifically some of our refining clients to take our look at that. But it is not uncommon that you would be in that position. Yeah.
What's the driller cap?
Oh, the drill and tap? Yeah, so a drill and tap requirement has been included on the majority of the consent decrees we've seen. The most recent one I was actually reading this morning again was the DCP. And so that one in particular calls out the drill and tap requirement before it can be placed on the delayed repair.
If it's over 10,000, that's twice. We gotta do 2 for the tab. It's under 10,000.
I don't recall the over 10,000. You might be right.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's some, what we're seeing in the midstream drill and tap requirements is very different than what we're seeing in a lot of downstream drill and tap requirements, so. But it's also kind of specific to the CE.
Yeah, so it could be, you could end up with a CD that does require that. I know it's not all we were going to do, but it is a potential for expectation on that. And again, this is also where it's important that when you get going, I'll speak to this shortly, but as you start going through this process, if you're unfortunate enough to be in this position, to make sure that it's not just the lawyer sitting down and evaluating these requirements, but also getting the technical staff involved to understand what you are going, or a company is going through those negotiations, to make sure that you're not putting yourself in a position that you can't achieve what they're putting under that consent decree. The other one that kind of took me by surprise was the connector replacement. So if you have chronic leakers, you may have to replace that if it leaks twice within, let's say on a valve within 2 quarters, or maybe if it's a connector twice in 2 monitoring periods above a certain leak threshold. Now you have to go out, and next time you have a shutdown, you have to replace them. The DCP, specifically the DCP CD, even provides you with a description of what and or how to make those replacements. Not just simply go and, add some tape or make another twist, but actually replace that connection. OGI requirements. I heard Costa say this morning as well. I hate to keep going back to his discussion this morning, but one of his comments this morning was that they were looking to, over the last several years, put more OGI into these CDs and more OGI requirements. In this case, you're looking at a semi-annual OGI camera sweep of the facility, not just of LDAR components, and then a quarterly on all the fin fund plugs sweep of those. And so that's not just we only have to go do this per quarter. That doesn't include, that's not in lieu of an annual method 21 on those fin fund plugs. So, how do you prepare for this? And as I said earlier, involve your technical team for those negotiations. let them help you to put yourself in a position to have a CV that's attainable in achieving the goals that they're trying to get at. And then realistically start taking a look at how you can get through the SOPs, get through the documentation and the administrative pieces so that when you flip that switch, you're ready. Get through the training as well. This is the time to reset your program. Designate or hire an LDAR coordinator. Make sure that you have somebody who's going to take ownership of that. But don't just hire somebody or find somebody, whether it's a contractor or it's internal, and say, hey, take ownership of this. The senior management, both at the senior management level as well as the field level, have to be willing to also take ownership of those programs. The MFC process that will have to be written into the LDAR program we spoke to earlier, if you don't have that in place and if you don't have the buy-off of the field reps, your LDAR program fails pretty quickly. And I think anybody that has a program already would understand that. So complete your SOPs, complete your SOPs and your protocols, and get folks trained and through that piece before you get to that time. Develop the QA/QC programs. Take a look at, finding a drill and tap operator. If you're out in the middle of Wyoming, if you're out in the Pine Atlantic line, you're a long ways to find a good drill and tap contractor if you have a facility out there. So find who can do that, get your contracts in place. Also, start looking at those low E requirements. Make sure you start getting documentation of everything that you're buying, procuring, and have the documentation of that. That is one of the expectations for the low E requirement. Really, they're looking to have you effectively, long-term, replace all of your valves with low E valves. Don't wait. The lower leak definitions are going to hurt. If you're not looking at your program, if you were already just if you thought you might transition into a quad lake program to begin with, then it's pretty easy to run reports, whether it's a leak valve, a guide wire, whatever, central, whatever it is you're using to track your program. It's pretty easy to run a report for anything that's had a reading between 500 and 10,000 or 500 and 2,000 per call. Start attacking those now. If you know you're going through this process and you have a shutdown coming up or a turnaround coming up in the next 3 to 6 months, start running those reports. Identify whether or not there's going to be something that you're going to have to try to go back and fix, repair, replace. And then ideally, implement an internal leak definition. You can implement that before you get to the consent decree. You're also going to have a lower leak rate percentage when it comes time to flip that switch. Another thing that at the end of the day, when that time comes, this didn't just happen overnight. You know that it was coming, but at the same time, you're still going to have some form of a time date expectation. So whether that's having everything in place and you have reached the expectation within 180 days, whether that's 90 days, there's going to be expectations set in that consent decree. If you can help shorten that before you fall into it, before it's launched, then you're going to be in a better position to not inadvertently miss equipment, miss out on PNID reviews, miss out on repairs, or more importantly, be in a position where you have a lot of components placed on the delay of repair or a lot of drill and taps required based upon the number of leaks you find. So if you've prepared appropriately, won't be difficult. You roll into it. Hopefully your training has already occurred. Maybe you've already started to operate. One of the things that has worked well for some of our clients is an internal leak tracking program. Tag tracking program. So if you have a change in the tagging process, if you have a swap out in the field, having a documentation process for that, for anything added, deleted, replaced, and tracking your tag numbers, tracking your components. Really a good MOC, that's a part of your MOC process. That's going to help this program and this transition as well. And then track your deviations. So I touched on the regulatory applicability timelines. They may give you a little more time than expected, but again, it shouldn't be an overnight thing to have to figure out. You should have some understanding. I know that there's some consent decrees that have taken several years to get to the point where they're near lodging. So as that time goes on, don't dig in your heels, find ways to work with the regulator and, observe the reporting and the documentation you have. Again, if you're reporting a lot of or no leaks, you probably want to take a look at your data, identify why that might be. Have you spent any time in the field with those technicians? You also might be able to stagger the implementation over time. Really recently, Brian has worked on a couple of these projects and identifying ways to maybe identify your higher leaker facilities, or if you've got a KKK facility that's never been inventoried for your connectors, that might be the first giant you want to tackle. Some folks may want to try and do the easiest thing first, but the time, the complications may delay your implementation across the rest of your programs. Again, it's usually not just one facility, it's usually a lot of facilities when you're looking at these midstream consent decrees. Compliance certification and reporting, and again, that reporting piece is due within 30 days after the initial, the initial year of that consent decree. Typically, it'll include specific reporting times. I spoke earlier to having those 30-day requirements on the QAQC, as well as any CAP implementation and corrective action plan implementation. Not going to spend a lot of time on stipulated penalties, but it is something that we would speak to from the standpoint of if you're having a difficult time getting the buy-off at the field level or the facility level, you go back and start to take a look at some of these stipulated penalties for missed inspections, for OELs, for not complying with the drill and tap procedures and requirements, DORs, et cetera. They start to get to the point of this is the cost of the facility. Most of the facilities we work with, their EHS is tied to their bonus. And some of those variances are going to be tied to their bonus. They may pay closer attention to this. So I went through this fairly quickly. Understanding what causes a CD, I think our real take-home message here is as I broadly went over some of the different CD requirements that you can expect, but I think the big take-home message that I'd like for you to go away from this is, first, complete your programs as though you could be audited tomorrow. Second, as you're going through your facilities, go through that QAQC process. When I say QAQC, I mean, look at your reports, look at how quickly monitoring is being done, look at all of the record-keeping requirements that are already expected of you. If you're making changes to your facilities, evaluate whether or not you should be in this, seeing it in a different rule set audit. What we have seen is, by and large, it's oftentimes, or where I've seen a lot of 114 requests have come from facilities that were in a lower or an earlier regulation set. And then followed through with, okay, let's look at the reports, let's look at the rest of it. And ultimately it results in being pushed over into the quality program.
Question. When you had to talk about replacement of equipment, if it's been marked with DOR or twice, when they say low, how do they define the low E/valve or the seal device? They do the same thing with the downstream requirements where they say that to be validated by testing, et cetera, which kind of refers to API or.
Yep. So it's all going to go back to API. It's all going to go back to, then now you have another record keeping piece of documenting that all of the valves that you're adding are low E. Another piece to that is, there's not very many valves out there now at this point that doesn't have that certification, but if you do have a valve that doesn't meet the certification and you cannot find a low E alternative for that, they're gonna ask you to go back and revalidate that every 1 to 2 years. And then document that you went through the process of trying to identify. Other questions?
I think you've done a good job.
Cover just enough to not be too complicated. Well, that way everybody used to go grab a beer earlier.
Yeah.
Four o'clock. I gotta give, there may be other meetings, but more than likely they're on their way home. Huh? So more than likely they're on their way home.
Who, everybody in the, because of the weather?
No, it's Thursday afternoon on Easter.
Are Palmer's in there too, from yesterday?
Do you have the ones you now?
Yep. She was getting a couple more people to sign.
You only had. So like some people are saying, oh, I've got this vessel. There, so this vessel, I've got enough. Say. One product. That's enough for me to tell that. We wouldn't.
Control.
But the more extreme, now you.
Oh, he had a PDF open. Like wondering why it was different than all the PowerPoints that have been open.
That's what I'm saying.
Fancy like that. I got a presentation for us and everything. Not a presentation, 2 slides.
Yeah, and they are saying why you made it different. Trigger for corridors, respectively, versus if you want.
All right, so I need to remove David, he's not gonna be here.
But that's why I was like, because that's kind of. That's like different things can, then how do I find any downside? Is there some, you know, how TP has the other, they can be, but, yeah, if you think there's something, because I couldn't find anything to get started.
Dwindle down.
Is that not like a big, but
I'm not quite sure why David had to go, but. Y'all sit up here, I'll sit down here. There are the extras.
You've got one train here.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've seen
One.
Even though you are interconnected, you could say it's a separate train, but it's interconnected. Would you be able to still?
You're still running these other.
Yeah, when I went to look to see if Derek was around or
Yeah.
doing that remotely, he was doing the gasoline mat.
Yeah, he's supposed to in there, because I saw some people that didn't know who he was. And then the moderator was like, does anybody know what Derek Reese looks like? I'm like, he must be new to this conference. Ask that question. How are you doing, man? How are you?
How's it going?
How's it going?
Mike Cupper with Montrose.
Paul, sounds like you said my last name.
Well, it's funny because I was like,
Cupper, Tupper.
Yeah.
Cupper, Tupper. What'd you say? Cupper, Tupper?
Yeah.
Cupper, Tupper. Yeah, it's like, oh, wait, somebody misspelled my name.
Yeah. Day going.
I'm here.
Yeah.
You?
That's the SME sit up there. Sit up there.
I thought you guys might be brothers and then I
Yeah.
realized there was a slight variation.
We were just
Yeah,
having
we were
that
just making-
discussion.
Distant cousins.
Yeah.
One from the west end, one from the
No
east
offense,
end.
Paul, but I don't think
Okay.
they'd be brothers.
Are we all good or is ready for the next one or
Do we need to record this one? It's one of the,
you don't need to if you.
it's not a
yeah.
presentation. It's just 2 slides.
Okay, then yeah, no, it doesn't need to be recorded,
Okay.
but I think just,
It's more of an open discussion.
yeah, I think just join the Teams meeting though.
Oh.
Is that all right?
I will let you take care of that then.
Yeah, mind if I? Let's see. Those are already. That's right. Okay.
Maybe the
That